9-year-old girl takes son to the hospital. She says for words. Nurse turns pale and calls 911. The small, two-bedroom house on Maple Street in Willow Creek, Ohio, looked like any other on the block. A faded American flag hung limply from the porch, and a rusty swing set sat mostly unused in the patchy backyard. Inside, however, the air was often thick with a tension that 9-year-old Alice felt in her bones. Alice was a small girl, with bright, observant blue eyes that had seen too much for her young age. Her brown hair was usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes, while clean, were often hand-me-downs. She was fiercely protective of her 4-year-old brother, Ben. Ben was a whirlwind of energy, with a mop of sandy blonde hair and a gap-toothed grin that could melt even the coldest heart. He was, in Alice's eyes, the one bright spot in their often dim world. Their father, Robert Miller, was a man of shifting moods. He worked sporadically as a handyman, picking up odd jobs around town. When he was sober, he could be playful and even kind, building elaborate Lego castles with Ben or teaching Alice how to identify different types of birds. But those moments were becoming increasingly rare. More often, he was withdrawn, sullen, and prone to explosive outbursts of anger. The smell of beer often clung to him, a heavy, sour scent that Alice had come to associate with fear. Their mother, Sarah, had left 2 years ago. Alice remembered snippets of shouting matches, slammed doors, and then, one day, her mother's tear-streaked face as she hugged them goodbye. Sarah had promised to come back for them, to send for them once she was settled. But the letters had dwindled, and then stopped altogether. Alice kept a faded photograph of her mother tucked under her pillow, a tangible reminder of a life that felt like a distant dream. Alice had learned to navigate her father's moods like a sailor navigating a stormy sea. She knew the signs of the way his jaw would clench, the slight slurring of his words, the restless pacing. She would try to keep Ben out of his way, distracting him with games or stories, steering him towards the relative safety of their shared bedroom. She'd learned to be quiet, to make herself small, to disappear into the background. That evening, the air in the house was particularly heavy. Robert had lost a job earlier in the day, a lucrative contract to repair a leaky roof on the town's old bakery. Alice had overheard the phone call, the raised voices, the eventual slam of the receiver. She knew what that meant. She busied herself making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for Ben, carefully cutting them into triangles, the way he liked. Ben was humming a tuneless song, drawing on a piece of scrap paper with crayons. "Alice," Ben said, looking up, his brow furrowed. "Daddy's making that face again." Alice's heart sank. She glanced towards the living room, where Robert was slumped on the couch staring blankly at the television. His face was tight, his eyes bloodshot. "He's just tired, Benny," she said, forcing a lightness into her voice. "Let's eat our sandwiches in our room, okay? We can build a fort." Ben, easily distracted, readily agreed. Alice quickly gathered their plates and led him down the short hallway to their bedroom. She closed the door behind them, a flimsy barrier against the gathering storm. They ate their sandwiches, giggling as they pretended their bed was a pirate ship. Alice tried to lose herself in the game, to push away the knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. It started with a crash. A lamp, Alice guessed, from the sound of shattering glass. Then, Robert's voice, roaring like a wounded animal. Ben flinched, his eyes wide with fear. "Stay here," Alice whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't come out, no matter what." She crept towards the door, her heart pounding against her ribs. She peeked through the crack, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Robert was standing over Ben, who was cowering on the floor, his small hands covering his head. A broken picture frame lay scattered around him. Ben had apparently wandered out of the bedroom, drawn by the noise, and had accidentally knocked over the frame while trying to get his father's attention. "You clumsy little idiot," Robert yelled, his face contorted with rage. He raised his hand, and Alice saw the glint of his belt buckle. Alice didn't think. She reacted. She burst through the door and threw herself in front of Ben, shielding him with her body. The first blow landed on her back, a searing pain that stole her breath. She cried out, more in surprise than anything else. Robert, momentarily stunned by Alice's intervention, hesitated. He looked down at her, his eyes flickering with a mixture of anger and something else, something that looked almost like confusion. "Get out of the way, Alice," he growled, his voice thick with alcohol. "No," Alice said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Don't hurt him, Daddy. Please." Robert wavered. He took a step back, then another. The rage seemed to drain out of him, leaving him looking tired and defeated. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his shoulders slumping. "Just go to your room," he mumbled, turning away. He stumbled back to the couch and collapsed onto it, burying his face in his hands. Alice, trembling but relieved, helped Ben to his feet. He was sobbing, his face streaked with tears and snot. Alice hugged him tightly, whispering soothing words into his ear. She checked him for injuries, her hands shaking. She found a red welt on his arm, where the picture frame had likely hit him, and a small bruise on his cheek. Once Ben had calmed down somewhat, Alice led him back to their bedroom. She locked the door, a small click that felt like a monumental act of defiance. She knew it wouldn't keep their father out if he really wanted to get in, but it offered a semblance of security. She sat on the bed with Ben, holding him close. They stayed like that for a long time, listening to the sounds of their father's muffled sobs from the living room. Alice knew that something had shifted. The fragile truce that had existed in their house had been shattered. As the night wore on, and the house grew quiet, Alice made a decision. She couldn't stay there anymore. It wasn't safe. She had to protect Ben. She waited until she was sure her father was asleep. Then, she carefully packed a small backpack with a few essentials, a change of clothes for each of them, Ben's favorite stuffed animal, a worn-out teddy bear named Patches, the photograph of their mother, and a small, plastic piggy bank containing the few dollars she had saved. She woke Ben gently, whispering, "We have to go, Benny. We have to go somewhere safe." Ben, still half asleep and confused, didn't argue. He trusted Alice completely. Holding hands, they crept out of the house, stepping out into the cool night air. The street was deserted, they only sound the chirping of crickets. Alice didn't know where they were going, but she knew they had to get away. They walked for what felt like hours, Alice pulling Ben along when he started to lag. Finally, they reached the brightly lit emergency room entrance of Willow Creek Community Hospital. Alice had seen it before, when Ben had fallen off his bike and needed stitches. It was the only place she could think of that might be safe. Taking a deep breath, Alice pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped inside. The brightly lit waiting room, with its rows of plastic chairs and the hushed murmur of voices, felt like another world. A nurse at the reception desk looked up, her eyebrows raising in surprise at the sight of two small children, alone, in the middle of the night. Alice walked up to the desk, her small hand gripping Ben's tightly. She looked the nurse straight in the eye and said, in a voice that was surprisingly clear and steady, "My dad did this." She gestured to Ben's bruised cheek and her own back, where she knew the welt from the belt buckle was still burning. "We need help." The nurse, a middle-aged woman named Susan with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, immediately ushered Alice and Ben into a small examination room. She spoke softly, reassuringly, asking gentle questions. Alice, exhausted but resolute, answered them honestly, recounting the events of the evening with a chilling clarity. Then, clinging to Patches, mostly stayed silent, his eyes wide and watchful. Susan examined Ben's injuries, noting the bruise on his cheek, the welt on his arm, and the older, fainter marks that hinted at previous incidents. She also examined Alice's back, where the angry red welt from the belt buckle was already starting to bruise. Her expression was grim, but her touch remained gentle. "You did the right thing coming here, Alice," Susan said, her voice full of compassion. "You're both very brave." As soon as she had finished her examination, Susan made a phone call. Alice didn't understand all the words, but she heard the phrases child abuse, emergency situation, and police involvement, and a knot of fear tightened in her stomach. But she knew this was necessary. Within minutes, two police officers arrived at the hospital. Officer Ramirez, a tall, imposing man with a neatly trimmed mustache, and Officer Chen, a younger woman with a warm smile, introduced themselves. They spoke to Alice and Ben separately, asking more detailed questions about their father and the abuse they had suffered. Alice repeated her story, her voice unwavering. She described her father's drinking, his anger, the fear that had become a constant presence in their lives. She told them about her mother leaving, about the broken promises, about the feeling of being trapped. Officer Chen spoke to Ben, using simple language and a gentle tone. Ben, initially shy, gradually opened up, pointing to his injuries and whispering, "Daddy hurt me." He clung to Patches, his small body trembling. After the interviews, Officer Ramirez explained the next steps to Alice. "We're going to have to take you both into protective custody," he said. "That means you'll be staying with a foster family for a while, until we can figure out what's best for you." Alice's heart sank. She had hoped, against all reason, that there might be another solution. But she understood. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Will Ben be with me?" she asked, her voice small. "Yes," Officer Ramirez assured her. "You'll stay together." Officer Chen contacted Child Protective Services CPS. A caseworker, a woman named Ms. Jackson, arrived at the hospital shortly after. Ms. Jackson was a brisk, efficient woman, but her eyes held a hint of weariness that suggested she had seen too much of this kind of thing. Ms. Jackson explained the process to Alice, outlining the legal procedures and the temporary nature of the foster care placement. She assured Alice that they would do everything they could to find a safe and supportive environment for her and Ben. While Ms. Jackson made arrangements, Susan brought Alice and Ben some food, sandwiches, juice, and cookies. It was the first real meal they had eaten all day, and Alice realized how hungry she was. Ben, however, only picked at his food, his appetite diminished by fear and exhaustion. As the night wore on, Alice felt a growing sense of exhaustion. The adrenaline that had fueled her escape was fading, leaving her feeling drained and overwhelmed. But she knew she had to stay strong for Ben. She was all he had. Finally, Ms. Jackson returned with news. "We found a temporary placement for you," she said. "A couple named Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. They live just outside of town. They're experienced foster parents, and they're ready to take you both in tonight." Alice felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She was grateful that they had found a place, but she was also terrified of the unknown. What would the Petersons be like? Would they be kind? Would they understand? Officer Chen drove Alice and Ben to the Petersons' house. It was a long drive, and Ben fell asleep in the back seat, his head resting on Alice's shoulder. Alice stared out the window, watching the dark countryside roll by. She felt a profound sense of loneliness, a feeling of being adrift in a world that seemed suddenly vast and uncaring. The Petersons' house was a large, two-story farmhouse surrounded by fields. It looked warm and inviting, with lights glowing in the windows. As they pulled up the driveway, a woman came out onto the porch, waving. Mrs. Peterson was a stout woman with a round, friendly face and silver hair pulled back in a bun. She greeted them with a warm smile and a hug for each of them. Mr. Peterson, a tall, lanky man with a weathered face and kind eyes, stood behind her, nodding in greeting. "You must be Alice and Ben," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice gentle. "We're so glad to have you here. Come on in. You must be exhausted." The house was cozy and welcoming, filled with the scent of baking bread. A fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the living room. Alice felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they would be okay. Mrs. Peterson showed them to a bedroom with two twin beds, neatly made up with colorful quilts. There were toys scattered around the room, and a bookshelf filled with children's books. Ben immediately gravitated towards a stuffed dinosaur, his eyes lighting up for the first time since they had left their home. Mrs. Peterson helped them get settled, providing them with clean pajamas and toothbrushes. She tucked Ben into bed, reading him a short story before turning off the light. Alice, exhausted but unable to sleep, lay in her bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house. Mrs. Peterson came back and sat on the edge of Alice's bed. "It's okay to be scared, honey," she said softly. "You've been through a lot tonight, but you're safe here. We'll take care of you." Alice's eyes filled with tears again, but this time, they were tears of relief. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Mrs. Peterson stroked her hair gently. "Try to get some sleep," she said. "We'll talk more in the morning." She left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Alice lay in the darkness, listening to Ben's soft breathing. She thought about her father, about her mother, about the uncertain future that lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of safety, a glimmer of hope that things might eventually get better. She finally fell into the embrace of a deep, exhausted sleep. Alice woke to the smell of bacon and the sound of cheerful chatter. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure of where she was. Then, the events of the previous night came flooding back, a wave of anxiety washing over her. She looked over at Ben's bed. He was still asleep, curled up under the covers with Patches clutched tightly in his arms. Alice got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake him. She found her backpack by the door and changed into the clean clothes she had packed. She tiptoed out of the bedroom and followed the sounds of conversation to the kitchen. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson were sitting at a large wooden table, drinking coffee and talking. They looked up as Alice entered, their faces breaking into welcoming smiles. "Good morning, Alice," Mrs. Peterson said. "Did you sleep well?" Alice nodded shyly. "Yes, thank you. Come and join us for breakfast," Mr. Peterson said, gesturing to a chair. "We've got bacon, eggs, toast, and even some blueberry pancakes." Alice's stomach rumbled. She hadn't realized how hungry she was. She sat down at the table, and Mrs. Peterson placed a plate piled high with food in front of her. As she ate, Alice observed the Petersons. They seemed genuinely kind, their conversation easy and relaxed. They asked her about her favorite foods, her favorite colors, her favorite games. They didn't pry into the details of the previous night, but they made it clear that they were there to listen if she wanted to talk. Ben woke up shortly after and joined them at the table. He was initially shy and withdrawn, clinging to Alice's side. But Mrs. Peterson's gentle coaxing and a plate of pancakes soon brought a smile to his face. After breakfast, Mrs. Peterson showed them around the house and the farm. They had a large garden, a barn filled with animals, cows, chickens, and a friendly old horse named Daisy, and a sprawling backyard with a tire swing hanging from a giant oak tree. Ben was immediately captivated by the animals, his fear momentarily forgotten. He helped Mr. Peterson collect eggs from the chicken coop, giggling as the chickens clucked and fluttered around him. Alice watched them, a small smile playing on her lips. It was the first time she had seen Ben genuinely happy in a long time. Later that day, Ms. Jackson, the CPS caseworker, arrived for a visit. She spoke to Alice and Ben separately, asking them how they were adjusting to the foster home. Alice told her about the Petersons' kindness, about the animals, about the comfortable bedroom. Ben, still shy, mostly nodded and pointed, but he seemed content. Ms. Jackson also spoke to the Petersons, discussing the legal process and the next steps. She explained that the investigation into Robert Miller was ongoing and that a court hearing would be scheduled soon to determine custody arrangements. The news brought a fresh wave of anxiety for Alice. She worried about what would happen to her father, about whether they would ever see him again. She also worried about the possibility of being separated from Ben. That evening, after Ben was asleep, Alice sat down with Mrs. Peterson in the living room. She finally felt ready to talk about what had happened. "It wasn't always bad," Alice said, her voice hesitant. "Sometimes, Daddy was nice. He used to play with us, read us stories. But then, he would change. He would get angry, and he would yell, and he would hit us." Mrs. Peterson listened patiently, her hand resting gently on Alice's arm. "It's not your fault, Alice," she said softly. "Your father has a problem, and he needs help. But it's never okay for him to hurt you or Ben." Alice nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I miss my mom," she whispered. "She promised she would come back for us, but she never did." Mrs. Peterson pulled Alice into a hug. "I know, honey," she said. "It's okay to miss her. It's okay to be sad and angry and confused. You've been through a lot, and it's going to take time to heal." She continued to talk about the situation, in terms Alice could understand. Alice felt a sense of relief, finally being able to share her burden with someone who understood. The following days settled into a routine. Alice and Ben helped with chores around the farm, feeding the animals, weeding the garden, and helping Mrs. Peterson with baking. They played games, read books, and explored the vast expanse of the farm. Alice started to open up, slowly but surely. She found comfort in the predictability of the days, in the kindness of the Petersons, in the simple pleasures of country life. She still had moments of sadness and anxiety, but they were becoming less frequent, less overwhelming. Ben, too, was thriving. He was talking more, laughing more, his initial shyness fading away. He followed Mr. Peterson around like a shadow, mimicking his actions and asking endless questions. He had found a new friend in Daisy, the old horse, and spent hours brushing her mane and feeding her carrots. The Petersons were patient and understanding, providing Alice and Ben with the stability and support they desperately needed. They encouraged them to talk about their feelings, but they never pushed them. They created a safe and nurturing environment, a haven from the storm that had raged in their lives. One afternoon, while they were sitting on the porch swing, Alice asked Mrs. Peterson about their own children. "We had 2 sons, Mrs. Peterson said, a wistful smile on her face. "They're grown up now, with families of their own. We don't see them as often as we'd like, but they visit when they can." "Do you miss them?" Alice asked. "Of course," Mrs. Peterson said, "but we love being foster parents. It gives us a chance to help children who need a safe and loving home. It fills our house with laughter and joy." Alice thought about her own mother, about the empty space she had left in their lives. She wondered if her mother ever thought about them, if she ever regretted leaving. One evening, Ms. Jackson called with an update. Robert Miller had been arrested and charged with child abuse. He was being held in custody, awaiting trial. The news brought a mixture of relief and sadness to Alice. She was glad that he couldn't hurt them anymore, but she also felt a pang of guilt and sorrow for her father. Ms. Jackson also informed them that they had been trying to locate Sarah Miller, Alice and Ben's mother. They had found an address for her in California, but they hadn't been able to make contact yet. The possibility of seeing her mother again filled Alice with a mix of hope and trepidation. She didn't know what to expect. Would her mother want to see them? Would she be different? Would she take them back? The uncertainty hung over her, a cloud in the otherwise clear sky of her new life. But she had the Petersons, she had Ben, and she had the newfound strength that came from surviving the storm. She would face whatever came next, one day at a time. A few weeks after arriving at the Petersons' farm, Alice and Ben started attending therapy sessions with a child psychologist named Dr. Emily Carter. Dr. Carter's office was in a small, unassuming building in town, filled with toys and colorful artwork. Alice was initially hesitant, unsure of what to expect. She had never talked to a stranger about her feelings before. But Dr. Carter was kind and patient, her voice gentle and reassuring. She created a safe space for Alice to share her experiences, her fears, her hopes. In their first session, Dr. Carter asked Alice to draw a picture of her family. Alice drew a picture of herself, Ben, and the Petersons, standing in front of the farmhouse. She drew a small, faint figure in the distance, representing her father. She didn't draw her mother at all. "Tell me about your drawing," Dr. Carter said, her voice soft. Alice explained the picture, her voice hesitant at first, then gaining strength as she spoke. She talked about the good times with her father, the times when he was sober and loving. She talked about the fear, the anger, the constant tension that had permeated their home. She talked about her mother leaving, about the feeling of abandonment. Dr. Carter listened patiently, nodding occasionally, offering words of encouragement and understanding. She helped Alice to understand that her father's actions were not her fault, that she was not responsible for his choices. She helped her to process the trauma she had experienced, to begin to heal. Ben's sessions were different. He was too young to articulate his feelings in words, so Dr. Carter used play therapy. She provided him with toys and dolls, cars, building blocks, and observed how he interacted with them. She encouraged him to express his emotions through play, to act out his experiences in a safe and controlled environment. Ben often created scenarios where a daddy doll was angry and aggressive, and a child doll was scared and hiding. Dr. Carter would gently intervene, helping Ben to explore alternative scenarios where the child doll was safe and protected. Through these sessions, Dr. Carter helped Ben to process his trauma, to understand that he was not to blame, and to develop coping mechanisms for dealing with his fear and anxiety. Alice and Ben also had joint sessions with Dr. Carter, where they could talk about their shared experiences and support each other. These sessions were particularly helpful for Alice, who often felt responsible for Ben's well-being. Dr. Carter helped her to understand that she was not Ben's parent, that she was a child too, and that she deserved to be cared for as well. The therapy sessions were not always easy. There were tears, anger, and moments of intense sadness. But gradually, Alice and Ben began to heal. They learned to identify and express their emotions, to develop coping strategies, and to build resilience. The Petersons were supportive throughout the process. They attended family therapy sessions with Dr. Carter, learning how to best support Alice and Ben's emotional needs. They created a consistent, predictable routine at home, providing a sense of stability and security. Slowly but surely, Alice and Ben began to blossom. The shadows in their eyes began to fade, replaced by a glimmer of hope, a spark of joy. They were still children who had been through a terrible ordeal, but they were also survivors, learning to navigate their way towards a brighter future. As summer turned to fall, Alice and Ben started attending the local elementary school. Alice was placed in the 4th grade, Ben in pre-kindergarten. It was another big adjustment, another step into the unknown. Alice was nervous on her first day. She worried about making friends, about fitting in, about being seen as different. The Petersons reassured her, reminding her that she was brave and strong, and that she had nothing to be ashamed of. To her surprise, Alice found that she enjoyed school. She was a bright and curious student, eager to learn. She made friends with a girl named Sarah, who lived on a neighboring farm and shared her love of horses. Sarah was kind and understanding, and she quickly became Alice's confidant. Ben, too, adjusted well to school. He loved the playground, the arts and crafts, and the sing-alongs. He made friends easily, his infectious laughter drawing other children to him. School provided a sense of normalcy, a routine that helped to ground them. It also gave them a chance to interact with other children, to build social skills, and to feel like they belonged. However, the past still cast a shadow. Alice sometimes had nightmares, reliving the night they left their home. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, the images of her father's anger vivid in her mind. Ben, too, had moments of fear and anxiety. He would sometimes become withdrawn and clingy, particularly when he saw men who resembled his father. The Petersons were always there to comfort them, to reassure them that they were safe. They worked closely with Dr. Carter to develop strategies for managing Alice and Ben's anxieties, including relaxation techniques and positive self-talk. One afternoon, while Alice was playing with Sarah at her house, Sarah's father came home unexpectedly. He was a large man with a booming voice, and his sudden appearance startled Alice. She froze, her body tensing, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah, sensing Alice's distress, quickly intervened. "It's okay, Alice," she said softly. "This is my dad. He's really nice." Sarah's father, realizing that he had frightened Alice, knelt down and spoke to her gently. He introduced himself, offered her a cookie, and then gave them space to play. The incident was a reminder that Alice still had a long way to go in her healing process. But it also showed her that not all men were like her father, that there were kind and gentle men in the world. As the weeks passed, Alice and Ben continued to thrive. They were growing stronger, more confident, more resilient. They were learning to trust, to love, and to believe in a brighter future. The scars of their past would always be with them, but they were no longer defining them. They were learning to live with their past, not be consumed by it. The day of Robert Miller's court hearing finally arrived. Alice and Ben were not required to attend, and the Petersons, along with Ms. Jackson and Dr. Carter, agreed that it would be too traumatic for them. However, Mrs. Peterson accompanied Ms. Jackson to the courthouse to represent the children's interests and provide an update on their well-being. Alice and Ben stayed home with Mr. Peterson. They spent the day playing in the garden, trying to distract themselves from the looming uncertainty. Alice couldn't shake the feeling of unease and not of anxiety twisting in her stomach. She knew that the outcome of the hearing would significantly impact their lives. The courtroom was somber. Robert Miller sat at the defendant's table, looking pale and gaunt. He had pleaded not guilty to the charges of child abuse, claiming that the injuries were accidental. His lawyer, a public defender, argued that Robert was a loving father who had made mistakes under the influence of alcohol and stress. Ms. Jackson, acting as the children's advocate, presented the evidence, the medical reports, the police reports, Alice's testimony, and Dr. Carter's assessment. She painted a picture of a home filled with fear and violence, a home where 2 young children had lived in constant danger. Mrs. Peterson testified about Alice and Ben's progress since they had come to live with them. She described their initial fear and anxiety, their gradual healing, and their growing confidence. She emphasized the importance of providing them with a stable and loving environment. The judge listened intently to all the testimony. He asked Robert Miller pointed questions, challenging his claims of accidental injury. He reviewed the evidence carefully, his expression grave. Finally, he delivered his verdict. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice firm, "I find you guilty of child abuse. The evidence is overwhelming. You have betrayed the trust placed in you as a parent, and you have caused significant harm to your children." Robert Miller's face crumpled. He hung his head, his shoulders shaking. The judge sentenced him to several years in prison, with mandatory anger management therapy and substance abuse treatment. He also issued a restraining order, prohibiting Robert from contacting Alice and Ben. Ms. Jackson and Mrs. Peterson returned to the farm with the news. Alice felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by a complex mix of emotions: sadness for her father, guilt for feeling relieved, and a lingering fear that wouldn't entirely disappear. "He can't hurt us anymore, Alice," Mrs. Peterson said, hugging her tightly. "You're safe. You and Ben are safe." Ben, too young to fully understand the legal proceedings, seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. He clung to Alice, his eyes searching her face for reassurance. "It's okay, Benny," Alice said, stroking his hair. "We're okay." A few weeks later, another significant event occurred. Ms. Jackson contacted the Petersons with news about Alice and Ben's mother, Sarah. "We've finally been able to reach her," Ms. Jackson said. "She's living in California, working as a waitress." She was surprised to hear from us. Ms. Jackson explained that Sarah had been struggling with her own issues, including depression and financial instability. She had felt overwhelmed and unprepared for motherhood, which had led to her leaving. She had always intended to come back for Alice and Ben, but she had never felt ready. Ms. Jackson had arranged a video call between Sarah and the children. Alice was hesitant, unsure of what to expect. She had built up so many images of her mother in her mind, both positive and negative. She didn't know if she was ready to face the reality. The video call was awkward and emotional. Sarah looked older, her face lined with weariness. She cried when she saw Alice and Ben, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry," she said repeatedly. "I'm so sorry I left you. I was a terrible mother." Alice, surprisingly, felt a surge of compassion for her mother. She saw the pain in her eyes, the regret etched on her face. She realized that her mother was not a villain, but a flawed human being who had made mistakes. Ben, too young to remember his mother clearly, was shy and reserved. He hid behind Alice, peeking out at the screen with curiosity. The conversation was stilted, filled with long silences and tearful apologies. Sarah asked about their lives, about school, about the Petersons. Alice answered her questions honestly, but she kept a certain distance, a protective wall around her heart. At the end of the call, Sarah promised to stay in touch. She said she wanted to be a part of their lives, but she understood that it would take time to rebuild trust. Alice didn't know what to feel. She was glad to have finally spoken to her mother, but she was also wary. She didn't want to get her hopes up, only to be disappointed again. Over the next few months, Sarah made an effort to stay in contact. She sent letters and cards, small gifts for Alice and Ben's birthdays, and occasional video calls. She started therapy and found a more stable job. She seemed genuinely committed to rebuilding her relationship with her children. Alice gradually began to open up to her mother. She shared stories about school, about her friends, about her life on the farm. She started to ask questions about her mother's life, about her experiences, about her regrets. Ben, too, warmed up to Sarah. He started to call her mommy again, his initial shyness replaced by a cautious affection. Ms. Jackson and Dr. Carter monitored the situation closely, ensuring that the contact was in Alice and Ben's best interests. They facilitated supervised visits, gradually increasing the frequency and duration as the children became more comfortable. The first in-person visit was emotional. Sarah flew to Ohio and met Alice and Ben at Dr. Carter's office. Alice was nervous, her heart pounding in her chest. Ben clung to her hand, his eyes wide with apprehension. When Sarah walked into the room, Alice felt a rush of conflicting emotions: relief, anger, sadness, and a flicker of hope. Sarah knelt down and hugged them both tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I've missed you so much," she whispered. The visit was awkward at first, but gradually, the ice began to thaw. They played games, drew pictures, and talked about their lives. Alice saw a vulnerability in her mother that she hadn't seen before, a willingness to admit her mistakes and to try to make amends. Ben, initially shy, eventually climbed onto Sarah's lap, his small arms wrapped around her neck. He seemed to instinctively recognize her as his mother, a connection that had been broken but not severed. Over time, Sarah became a more consistent presence in their lives. She visited regularly, spending weekends with them at the Petersons' farm. She helped with homework, read them bedtime stories, and took them on outings to the park and the zoo. The Petersons welcomed Sarah into their home, recognizing the importance of her relationship with Alice and Ben. They treated her with kindness and respect, creating a supportive environment for the family to heal. The long-term plan for Alice and Ben remained uncertain. Sarah expressed a desire to eventually have them live with her, but she understood that it would take time and a lot of work to rebuild trust and stability. Ms. Jackson and the courts continued to monitor the situation, prioritizing the children's well-being above all else. The possibility of reunification with their mother was on the table, but it would depend on Sarah's continued progress and the children's emotional readiness. For now, they have a stable, temporary home. A year passed since Alice and Ben first arrived at the Petersons' doorstep, scared and injured. A year of healing, of growth, of learning to trust and love again. They were no longer the same children who had walked into the emergency room that night. They were stronger, more resilient, and more hopeful. Alice was thriving in school. She had made close friends, excelled in her studies, and discovered a passion for writing. She started keeping a journal, pouring her thoughts and feelings onto the pages, a form of therapy that helped her to process her experiences. Ben was a happy, energetic kindergartner. He loved playing with his friends, exploring the farm, and spending time with his sister and the Petersons. The shadows of his past still lingered, but they were fading, replaced by the bright light of his infectious laughter. Sarah continued to be a regular part of their lives. She had moved to a small town closer to Willow Creek, securing a stable job and a modest apartment. She visited Alice and Ben every other weekend, and they often spent holidays and school breaks with her. The relationship between Alice and Sarah was still evolving. There were moments of awkwardness, of unspoken resentments, of lingering doubts. But there was also a growing bond, a connection forged by shared history and a mutual desire for healing. Alice had started to call Sarah Mom again, but it was a tentative mom, a word spoken with both love and caution. She still held the Petersons close to her heart, regarding them as her second family, the people who had saved her and Ben when they needed it most. The legal proceedings continued, slowly but surely. Sarah had petitioned for full custody of Alice and Ben, but the courts were cautious, prioritizing the children's best interests. They ordered regular home visits, psychological evaluations, and progress reports. The Petersons supported Sarah's efforts, recognizing that reunification with their mother was the ultimate goal, as long as it was safe and healthy for Alice and Ben. They had grown to love the children deeply, but they knew that their role was to provide a temporary haven, a bridge to a permanent home. One evening, Alice sat down with Mrs. Peterson on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. "Do you think we'll ever live with Mom again?" Alice asked, her voice hesitant. Mrs. Peterson put her arm around Alice. "I don't know, honey," she said honestly. "But I know that your mom loves you very much, and she's working hard to make a good life for you. And no matter what happens, you'll always have a home here with us. You'll always be part of our family." Alice leaned her head on Mrs. Peterson's shoulder, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She knew that the future was uncertain, but she also knew that she was not alone. She had a support system, a network of people who cared about her and Ben, who would help them navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. Another year passed, marked by milestones and gradual changes. Alice entered middle school, navigating the complexities of adolescence with newfound confidence. Ben started first grade, his reading skills blossoming under the guidance of patient teachers. Sarah continued her steady progress, proving her commitment to being a responsible and loving parent. The court finally granted Sarah shared custody of Alice and Ben. It was a gradual transition, starting with extended weekends and holidays, then progressing to longer periods during the summer and school breaks. The Petersons remained involved, providing support and respite care when needed. The transition was not without its challenges. Alice and Ben had grown accustomed to the stability and routine of the Petersons' farm. They had to adjust to a new home, a new school when staying with Sarah during breaks, and a new dynamic with their mother. There were moments of friction, of misunderstandings, of old wounds resurfacing. But with the help of therapy and unwavering support of the Petersons and Ms. Jackson, they navigated these challenges, learning to communicate, to compromise, and to forgive. Alice found that she enjoyed spending time with her mother, getting to know her as a person, not just as a parent. They went shopping together, cooked meals together, and shared stories about their lives. Alice discovered that her mother had a creative side, a love of art and music that she had never known before. Ben, too, bonded with Sarah, his initial shyness replaced by an exuberant affection. He loved cuddling with her on the couch, reading stories with her, and playing games in the park. He started to call her mommy without hesitation, his voice filled with love and trust. Finally, after nearly 3 years of separation, the court granted Sarah full custody of Alice and Ben. It was a bittersweet moment. Alice and Ben were excited to be living with their mother again, to be a family once more. But they were also sad to be leaving the Petersons, the people who had been their rock, their refuge, their second family. The day they moved out of the Petersons' farmhouse was filled with tears and hugs. Alice and Ben promised to visit often, to stay in touch, to never forget the kindness and love they had received. "You'll always be part of our family, Mrs. Peterson said, her voice choked with emotion. "This will always be your home, too, Mr. Peterson." His eyes misty, ruffled Ben's hair. "You be good for your mom," he said, "and come back and see us soon." Alice and Ben settled into their new life with Sarah. Their apartment was small, but it was filled with love and laughter. They decorated their bedrooms with pictures of the Petersons, reminders of the special bond they shared. They continued to visit the Petersons regularly, spending weekends and holidays on the farm. They helped with chores, played with the animals, and shared meals around the familiar wooden table. The Petersons became their extended family, a constant source of support and love. Alice, now a teenager, continued to write in her journal, documenting her journey of healing and growth. She wrote about her father, about her mother, about the Petersons, about the challenges and triumphs of her life. She wrote about forgiveness, about resilience, about the power of love to overcome even the darkest of times. She began to share her writing. Ben, now a rambunctious 8-year-old, was thriving. He was a happy, well-adjusted child, his past trauma fading into the background, replaced by the joy and security of his present life. Sarah had found her footing as a mother. She was loving, patient, and supportive, providing Alice and Ben with the stability and nurturing they had craved. She had made mistakes, but she had learned from them, and she was determined to be the best mother she could be. One sunny afternoon, Alice was sitting on the porch swing at the Petersons' farm, watching Ben play with Daisy in the field. Sarah was sitting beside her, her arm around Alice's shoulders. "Thank you," Alice said softly, looking at Sarah, "for coming back for us." Sarah smiled, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me a second chance." Alice leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, feeling a sense of peace and contentment. She knew that life would always have its challenges, that there would be moments of sadness and uncertainty. But she also knew that she was strong, that she was resilient, and that she was surrounded by love. She was home.